If you've been following along with us this summer, you know that we've been in a summer-long series going through the book of Hebrews that we've entitled Jesus is Better. And we are actually down to our last 2 weeks of this series. So we're in chapter 13 today. Today is the 13th week. We're in chapter 13. I'm actually going to take a chunk here at the beginning of chapter 13. And then Jordan's going to finish it off next week with the last half of chapter 13. It almost worked out where there were 14 weeks and 14 chapters, but not quite, so we had to divide it up a little bit. So Hebrews chapter 13 this morning, I want to jump into the text really quick, and then we're going to kind of save it, and we're going to come back around here at the end. So let me just read the text, and then we'll kind of move forward. So this is Hebrews 13, verses 1 through 5. And this is what we're going to be focusing on this morning. And it says, "Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Keep your lives free from the love of money, and be content with what you have, because God has said, 'Never will I leave you or forsake you.'" So I realized in preparing this message that I've been on staff here for coming up on 2 years. And in all of my sermons that I've preached, I've not yet told a good tattoo story. Which is that's just a shame, really, that you haven't gotten to hear any good ones yet. But we're going to change that this morning. So I want to tell you a little bit about a tattoo story. And so the first tattoo I ever got was just after my 18th birthday. And thankfully, just a few months before that, I'd become a Christian. Because I was absolutely dead set on getting tattoos before I was a Christian. And who the heck knows what would have happened otherwise. And so thankfully, I became a Christian. So decided my first tattoo, pretty straightforward, would be across here on my right bicep. I was going to wear like a tank top today, but I was like, my wife probably wouldn't have let me out of the house that way. And so it's a cross. I should have had a picture or something, but it's a cross here in my right bicep, and it has John 11:25 underneath it, which is the verse that when I was in my college dorm room all alone, just in a place of despair, that's the verse that God brought to my mind. There's a whole story there. Where Jesus says, "I'm the resurrection and the life." And so I got that tattooed. And then I got a couple others. And then eventually, a little bit later, I got Jesus' face here up on my right shoulder. So I have the cross with John 11:25. And then I have like a side profile of Jesus' face, and I'm sure it's exactly what he looks like. When I get to heaven, he's going to be like, "Who's that?" Right? But, and so that's one of those things, but it's a side profile of him, and he's kind of like in agony, like crying out, and there's actually a tear trickling down from his eyes. So it's that, that part of the cross. I mean, obviously the pain and suffering. And so I had some other stuff, but I realized after a while that I really wanted to get like full sleeves. And if I wanted to do that, I needed to stop getting little ones here and there, and I needed to start getting, bigger concepts. So I went to my tattoo artist, and I said, "Hey, I have this cross, and I have Jesus' face. What I'd like to do on this top half of my arm, from my shoulder down, is to do like essentially a crucifixion scene. So I'd like you to put 2 smaller crosses on the side of the big cross with some hills, and I'd like to have some kind of clouds, and I'd like to have maybe something like a lightning bolt striking one of the crosses and purifying it because of the thief that was saved on the cross. And I'd like to have some sort of really kind of like heavenly, like sun type of thing up on my shoulder, kind of capping off." And he said, "Whoops," he said, "Okay." And so, good enough, right? And so I go in to make my appointment and go in, and he's like, "All right, let's kind of do this." So he pulls up my my shirt and safety pins it so it doesn't come down, and he starts to take a purple marker, like a fine tip marker. Purple is what they usually use, and he starts to draw on my arm, and he starts to draw this whole scene out, and he starts to draw the little crosses and all the stuff, and then he starts to draw up on my shoulder, and he starts to draw this really intricate pattern. this really intricate pattern of all these like diamonds that sort of form this sun, and there's different like levels. He's explaining to me I want to have like different degrees of shadow here, and it'll create this effect, and it'll be really cool. So I'm like all about it, awesome. And as he's drawing it, I'm really loving what he's doing. So I'm like, let's go for it. So he gets pretty much done, and he says really just matter-of-factly, now I know plenty of you have tattoos, so you have this experience on some level. Tattoo shops, interesting culture, right? And so he says just matter-of-factly, we're going to have to bloodline this. And I said, come again? What's bloodlining? Doesn't sound good. What does that entail? He's like, well, I just drew this freehand. I don't have a pattern for it. And so what I need to do, you know how it works, Josh. He's like, if I start tattooing and the ink sprays and I have to spray the alcohol to clean it, it's going to wipe away the pattern. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm like, well, okay, how do you do that? And he's like, well, we just take a dry needle and we go over the whole pattern until we scratch you till you bleed, and then we scratch the pattern into your arm, and then once we scratch the pattern into your arm, we wipe it off, and then we go back over, the open wounds with ink and inject that in. Sounds like fun. Yeah, okay, and but I'm acting very tough. And I had a 4-hour session set up for that. So I said, all right. And so he begins the bloodlining process. So again, just a dry needle, scratching me until blood comes up, and then he wipes it away, and we keep going. And so eventually I literally have this giant scratch in the shape of this awesome tattoo. But keep in mind, we have to go back over the whole thing now. If you've ever skinned your knee or something, and then you clean it up, and then you get in the shower and the water hits it, that feeling, like what I'm talking about, where it just shocks you? It's imagine that for basically by this point about 3 hours. And so I'm sitting there and we're talking, and I'm playing it cool or whatever. But after a little while, I start to just sweat profusely, and I start to feel pretty lightheaded, and it's the room's going a little bit wonky, and so. But I'm not saying anything about it. Well, he probably noticed that at some point. And he said, hey, are you all right? And the last thing, you're trying to be a tough guy, right? And the last thing you want is for him to be like, hey, are you okay, man? So I said, yeah, I'm fine. And he goes, no, you aren't fine. I can tell. And he goes, your blood sugar's dropping. He's like, we got to take care of that. He gives me, of all things, a Tootsie Pop. I'm like, what am I, a kid at a barber? Why do I have a Tootsie Pop? Come on. So, but that's what they keep on hand in a lot of shops is a hard candy and things like that because your blood sugar drops. So he's like, here, take this Tootsie Pop. And so I feel like I'm 5 years old again. And so I'm eating this Tootsie Pop, trying to get my blood sugar up while he's working on me. And it's humiliating, you know what I mean? You're kind of sitting there you're hoping nobody comes in and sees that going on or whatever. And I was humiliated. I was, a bit embarrassed. But the question, that I asked myself after the fact, and this is actually, believe it or not, a pretty profound point for this morning that we'll come back to, but the question is, why was I embarrassed? Okay, why was I embarrassed? Aside from all the silliness of the Tootsie Pop and all that kind of stuff, why was I embarrassed? Because the reality, and we have a slide for this, the reality is I wasn't doing anything wrong, right? The way I was feeling was a natural response to what was going on around me, right? You go through tattoos are considered to be minor surgery, and the trauma of that, and then you add the bloodlining thing in and all that. Why was I embarrassed? This was natural. We good? Okay. I wasn't doing anything wrong. What I was feeling was a natural response to what was going on around me. Makes sense, right? Switching gears just a little bit, there's a lot of good in this world. A lot of good. There are some amazing things that take place, amazing stories of kindness and generosity and compassion and self-sacrifice. And there are people who you look at their lives and you're like, oh my gosh, that's just amazing. And conversely, we know that there is a lot that is not good. In fact, there's a lot that is just flat out evil. There are things that you see on the daily news, wherever you get your news, that at times blow your mind, and you wonder, what is wrong with people? Like, how is this stuff even possible? How is this going on? And we see these terrible tragedies taking place, sometimes on mass levels, sometimes on individual levels. And we know that just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that you are in any way immune to those malevolent forces that sometimes impose themselves on us. Right? You only have to be alive for about 5 minutes to figure out that even the most godly people amongst us are subject to potentially terrible pain and suffering during their time here on earth. Right? No doubt many of you recently heard the tragic story of the young couple who were students up at Faith Baptist Bible College in Ankeny. And they had gotten married on July 27th, and then they traveled to Florida for their honeymoon. And on July 30th, just 3 days removed from their wedding, they were out swimming in the ocean when a rip current grabbed a hold of both of them. And the wife was able to stay afloat, but the husband wasn't. He was under the water for quite some time. He finally reemerged. Some nearby kayaker was able to come over and drag them to shore, but he suffered cardiac arrest and he ultimately passed away. 3 days after his wedding. His wife, 3 days now, was now a widow. I mean, we all suffer loss and pain in many forms, whether it be divorce, broken relationships with your kids and or your parents, broken relationships in many forms. We go through, some of us, incredible financial struggle and disasters and messes. Some of us struggle with mental health issues, whether it be anxiety, depression, or a myriad of other things. Some of us have gone through abuse, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and the resulting trauma from those things has altered our lives in ways that sometimes seems like, irreversible. Then we have health problems that we never saw coming. Things that just hit us out of nowhere. And the list goes on. And some of you, as I'm listing these things, you're thinking of things you've gone through or you're even currently experiencing. And we know, if we're brutally honest, which we should be, that no one is immune to that. No one's immune to it. And to think otherwise is very delusional. This is a feel-good message, right? Let me ask you this. Have you ever prayed intensely for something not to happen, and then it happened? I think we have a slide for this too. Or have you ever prayed intensely for something to happen, and it never happened? Let me repeat that. Have you ever prayed intensely for something not to happen, and then it happened? Or have you ever prayed intensely for something to happen, and it never happened? And I'm not talking about this. If you could leave that for a while. Take that one off if you wouldn't mind. I'm not talking about this in the Garth Brooks song, Unanswered Prayers, sort of the, term. If you've heard that song. Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. And Pastor Jordan even joked about that a few weeks ago. You wanted to maybe marry somebody, but now you see him on Facebook, and you're like, thank God that didn't work out, right? Right? And there's a legitimate hilarity to that, right? And there is a truth that I look back at my life, and I can say, man, I prayed for certain things, and I'm very glad that those weren't answered in the way that I wanted them to be at the time for various reasons. There's truth in that, and I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about are prayers that you needed to be answered, and they weren't. And when they weren't, you felt the proverbial walls closing in around you, and it took all the strength you had just to get out of bed in the morning. Or maybe you couldn't even get out of bed in the morning for quite some time. And when you finally did, you suddenly found the world around you to be an unfamiliar and terrifying place. Something in your life had been so significantly and dramatically altered that now the world you knew was unfamiliar. You would never see the world the same again as you had before. I'm talking about the sort of situation so intense, so traumatic, so hard, that when some well-meaning friend or acquaintance or random person on social media said something to you, again, well-meaning, but said something to you about it all being part of God's plan, your first instinct was to knock their teeth out. Maybe just me? Right. I mean, have you ever been in the middle of an awful situation, and while reading the Bible in search of comfort, you came across a passage like the one I read earlier, just a few moments ago to start the morning off, about, quote unquote, God never leaving you or forsaking you. And instead of it being comforting or encouraging, it stung like hell, literally. And you couldn't help but think to yourself, yeah, right. Unless I miss my guess, most of us in this room have been there in one form or another. And some of you maybe are there today and you've dragged yourself here despite that. We've all spent time somewhere on the spectrum, right? From a fundamental disillusionment with God to a body-trembling rage at God. We've all spent time on that spectrum, and sometimes we've been on that spectrum from one event back and forth as we go through sort of those stages or cycles of grief. And if I'm being brutally honest, when we do feel like this and we look for help in some form, any form, we're desperate and we reach out, most of the so-called advice out there isn't worth, be joking a little bit, but it's not worth a hill of beans, right? It's not worth anything. A lot of it can actually make things worse because instead of comforting you, it actually heaps more shame on you. It actually does additional damage. And I understand in some cases that the advice that you're given is well-meaning, but that doesn't mean it's good. And that doesn't mean that you should follow it. So with all of that being said, let's try, and I know it's a bold statement to make, but let's try and remedy some of that this morning. Are you ready? All right, here's the question then for this morning. This sermon was to have a title or a theme. Here it is. What should you do if you feel forsaken by God? What should you do, practically speaking, if you feel forsaken by God? If you feel like you read these verses in Hebrews 13 and you come to that place and you understand on some level intellectually or wherever that yep, I know that's a promise. It sure doesn't feel like that. It sure doesn't seem like that. In fact, all of the evidence right in front of my face points to the contrary. What do you do? Before I get into what I hope are some life-changing directives for you, let me offer a couple of hugely important preliminary thoughts. In fact, if you ignore the directives that I give today and you just get these two thoughts, I think those in themselves could be transformative. So, first thought is this. Number one, feeling as though God has forsaken you is not a sin. It's a feeling, right? And feelings are not inherently sinful. Feeling as though God has forsaken you is not a sin. It's a feeling. You're feeling a certain way. The feeling is not inherently sinful. What you do with it, how you act upon that, that's a bit different. But just because you're feeling a certain way, it doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. Go back to my tattoo story. Why was I embarrassed? What I was feeling as a result of what I was going through was very natural. It was a logical outcome of what I was going through. Number two, and this is key. This is key. If you feel as though God has forsaken you, stop shaming yourself because you don't feel like you think you should feel. and simply allow yourself to feel the way you do. Until this happens, the healing process can't and won't begin. This is a pretty deep and profound concept. For Christians, I've seen in how many years? Over 19 years of being a pastor now, I've seen this happen more times than I can count, and I will say I've done this to myself many times. I feel a certain way about something. I know I should feel differently. I should feel differently. And so I compound the problem by guilting myself and shaming myself. Why don't I feel this way? Why can't I effort myself into feeling this way? And I start to clench my fists and grit my teeth and try to drag myself into a feeling. You know how many times that's worked for me? You know how many times that's made things worse? 100%. So stop shaming yourself because of how you feel, or how you think you should feel, Say, okay, this is how I feel. I'm going to embrace it. It is what it is. I know I shouldn't feel this way. I don't want to feel this way. Let me admit that, and then let's go from there. When you do that, then the healing process can begin. Right? So what do you do if you feel like you're forsaken? This is a big thing. But for this point here that's still up on the screen, when you're asking, well, how does that look? What does that look like? I want you to think just about this reality of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Right, this crazy story that if you were writing a book about a heroic figure, you would never put in there. Right? If you wanted to talk about somebody being, always tough, always brave, always courageous, never fearful, never struggling with anything, you don't put this part in there, because what we find in the Garden of Gethsemane is Jesus begging God to let him out of it. He asks him multiple times, right? And this is Jesus who knew why he came, who knew who he was, knew why he came, had predicted how he was going to die. He knew that going in. And yet we find him here on the doorstep of the crucifixion, and he's begging God, saying, if there's any other way for this to happen, like, I don't know, God, come up with something. If you've got any other plans, could we do it that way instead? Could we do it that way instead? And we're told that he told the disciples that his soul was crushed to the point of death. And then we were told that his stress, the stress he was under, the intensity of the moment, some scholars think that it was actually kind of like a borderline panic attack. Like it was that sort of feeling. That it was so intense that he started to sweat great drops of blood, we're told. That's actually a phenomenon that astronauts experienced in the early days when they would go up and launch through the Earth, get out of the Earth's orbit, and the G-forces were so intense on them as they're trying to be propelled at however many thousands of miles an hour, and the forces are pushing against them of gravity. It would so compact them and so intense on them, their capillaries would start to burst out of their skin. They would literally like sweat drops of blood. Think about the intensity of that moment for Jesus. This is Jesus, right? Our model for God. The image of the invisible, the exact representation. And we find him in this moment being very, very willing to feel what he feels and to even verbalize it and articulate it so that it was written down. And it was a crucial part of this story, right? There were no cliches in here in Jesus' plea to God. It was real emotion, real stress, on some levels, real panic. In fact, in Matthew 26:38, where he talks about being overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, the Greek, one of the ways it's translated is that he was swallowed up in sorrow and crushed with grief. It overwhelmed him. So when you're thinking about how I don't feel the way that I should feel, and you start to shame yourself, I would refer you to Matthew 26. Go and see Jesus in the garden. So what do you do if you feel like God's forsaken you? What I've just said plays into this first kind of point / directive / tip, whatever you want to call it. First one is recognize that when you feel this way, that you are in good company. Recognize that you are in good company. I, again, been a pastor for quite a long time now. If I had to boil the enemy's tactics down to one thing that I think is his primary tactic in ways that he wants to tear apart Christians and people for that matter, I think his primary tactic, and this is Josh Goodman's opinion, so I'm not saying it's gospel, but my opinion is the enemy's number one tactic is he wants to isolate. He wants to isolate. He wants to make you feel like you are alone in everything that you're going through, that nobody else can understand, that your experience is unique to you, that because nobody else has gone through it or is going through it or has gone through it, that nobody can help you, there's no place for you to turn. He wants to isolate you. He wants to put you on an island where you feel like no help can come. But when you recognize that you're in good company, when you can look, first of all, through Scripture and find that King David felt this way on many occasions. If you read the prophet Jeremiah, he actually, talks to God about how God has lied to him. He actually accuses God of lying to him. Can you imagine that? Right? And this is a prophet, a whole book. He says, God, you have deceived me, and I have allowed myself to be deceived. You told me this would happen, and now this is happening instead. Right? Jesus, again, in the Garden of Gethsemane, feeling the way that he did. The Apostle Paul writes, right? I can't remember if it's Galatians or I can't remember which scripture right off the top of my head, but he says, you are not unaware, brothers, of the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were in despair for our very lives. We were presented with burdens, he says, that were far beyond our ability to bear, to the point that we despaired for even life itself and felt we had received the sentence of death. This is Paul, right, who sings hymns in prison, and it seems like he's always able to push through, and he says, nope, in this one spot in my life, I was despairing. It was beyond what I could bear. I thought we were done for, right? We know that even in Paul's letters to Timothy, we know that Timothy, if you read between the lines in a lot of it, had great issues with fear. He had some serious anxiety issues. Paul, in fact, tells him at one point, stop drinking just water, take some wine to calm yourself down. No, I'm serious. Because he had stomach issues that seemed to be very much related to anxiety. Right? So I've given you some biblical characters, but what about other, because you're like, well, those are the people in the Bible, and I get that. A modern day figure that would probably be considered one of the giants of our faith is a guy most of you heard of named C.S. Lewis. He wrote a lot of great stuff, and I encourage you to read any of it. One of the most undervalued books of his that I think is probably, in my opinion, honestly, his best book that I've gotten the most out of is a little book, 75, 80 pages, called A Grief Observed. A Grief Observed. He wrote it right after his wife died, and she died way too young. And he wrote this. This is C.S. Lewis, right? Giant of the faith. When you're happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is in vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. This is how C.S. Lewis felt about God after his wife died. And he was generous enough and humble enough to put it down in words and let it be published so that people could understand that they're not alone. They're not isolated in this. They're not the only ones who feel this way. Even the most mature, well-developed Christians amongst us go through seasons where they go to God and they find a door slammed in their face. That's how they feel. And a bolting and a double bolting on the inside. Recognize that you're in good company. Number 2, examine your image of God. Examine your image of God. And man, there's like 9 sermons in this point alone, but I'll make it short. And honestly, if this one right here, let me just put in a little bit of a plug for Jordan's Bible study starting on Wednesday night. If you haven't signed up and you're interested, the God is Good study deals with all this stuff. I mean, this is a good time, as hard as it might be. This is a good time to do some hard work that you might not otherwise do. Because when everything's floating along, it's rare that we examine our image of God, but when things come crashing down around us, we tend to have a bit more of a reflective, bent to us. The question is, who is the God that you think has forsaken you? Who is the God that you feel has left you alone? What is his character and his nature as you see it? Have you ever thought about that when you're wrestling with this stuff and you're in pain? Have you ever stopped to think about who is the God that I believe in? What's he actually like? How does that play itself out right now? Have you ever gone into Scripture and just wrestled with it? And Scriptures like the one from Hebrews 13, he'll never leave me or forsake me. What does that look like practically? How does that play out? Am I missing understanding what that means? And you start to wrestle with that. You start to really get in and do some super important work. And I would never, ever say in a million years that God put you through something so you would do this work. But I believe that when you go through something painful and hard, this kind of work can be insanely redemptive. And it can bring incredible good out of terrible places. To begin to examine your image of God. And there's so many places and situations from which we get our image of God. The Bible tells us very straightforwardly it's from Jesus. But because we're just people and we go through life and we have influences and things that factor in, we sort of have this amalgamation, right? This conglomeration of things that form our image of God. In fact, an author that I like says this, and you can agree or disagree with it, but I think he makes a profound point. He says, and he's speaking just for males here because this book has to do with mostly the male life, but he says, what you have to understand is your father was your model for God. If you are male and you're Christian and you live in America, your father is your model for God. And if you never know your father, or if your father bails on you, or he dies, or he's never a home, what do you believe about God? What you end up doing is spending your life searching for a father in God. And there's this sort of profound thing here that for many of us, male or female, that our image of God comes from our fathers. And so if we had fathers growing up who were distant, who were disinterested, who were impossible to please, who abandoned us, who were abusive to us, try as we might, those images of that father factor into our image of God as Father. And I can't tell you how many Christians that I've talked to over the years who have said, I have zero problem with Jesus. I have zero problem with the Holy Spirit. I cannot get down with God the Father. And if you press in just a little bit and say, tell me more about that, 100% of the time, it comes back to something related to their fathers. This is not a thing I'm making up. There's actually a psychological term called the father wound. And it's something that thankfully the Christian church has begun to address. Because we understand if we're going to serve and love a God, it's probably important that we're able to actually truly love him and see him for who he is and not some image we've created him in. Man, there's so much to this, but I need to keep going. But just know this. Begin to think about that. And ask God with this one, I would say, examine your image of God. I don't want you to hear that as a task, as a burden. What I want you to do is just ask God to help you with it. Just if all you can do is pray, God, show me who you really are. I know I probably have some messed up ideas, and that's not your fault, by the way. You came by those honestly. That's part of the deal. Ask God to show you this stuff. Number 3. So recognize you're in good company. Examine your image of God. Number 3, don't disengage. Do not disengage. This plays into number 1, where the enemy wants to isolate you, to make you feel alone, to put you on the fringes. And this one is where we do have a bit of a responsibility here. As hard as it can be, don't disengage on two levels. Don't disengage with God. If you are angry at him, if you feel like he's abandoned you, whatever it is, don't disengage with him. Be honest with him about where you are at, how you feel, and verbalize that. He knows anyway. You're not hiding anything from him. So if your prayers are pure, just rage, get after it. Rage as hard as you possibly can at him. You see this throughout Scripture. The trick is that you're still going to him with it, right? Don't take it other places. Don't let it spread like a virus. Go directly to him with it, right? Psalm 130, verse 1. I actually have it tattooed in Latin on my arm, is De profundis. It's true. De profundis clamave ad te domine, which means from the depths of despair, I cry out to you, O God. This is David, right? When he's hiding in a cave. From the depths of despair, I cry out to you, O God. This is David writing and talking to God. These hymns, by the way, these psalms were the Hebrew songbook for thousands of years. So they would repeatedly sing this, acknowledging this is a valid thing to feel. But the thing with David was he always directed it towards God. He never disengaged. So don't disengage. I have a friend who, gosh, I don't know how many years ago it is now, a lot of years ago, he was a worship pastor was very talented. And he had developed an issue on his vocal cord. And he had kind of like a little bit of like a, I don't know what you call it, not a cyst, but this kind of an issue. And they had to surgically remove it, no big deal, whatever. He goes into the surgery, he comes out with no voice. He's a worship pastor. He's a music guy. And it's been 30 years now, I'm going to say. And he can talk for exactly 1 hour a day. And he's in excruciating pain when he does. And he turned to writing, and he's written a ton of books. But the first book that he wrote, and I would encourage you to get it, he's admitted it's not a very good book in the sense of like the writing, but the concepts and the lessons in it are profound, because he wasn't a writer at the time. And it's called In His Face. In His Face. And the author's name is Bob Sorge, S-O-R-G-E if you're writing it down. In His Face. And the whole point of the book is like, no matter where you're at, the pain you're in, the suffering, the feelings of abandonment, get in God's face about it. Don't turn your back. Don't disengage. And the second part of this not disengaging is do your best to stay in community. Do not remove yourself from community. The tendency when we're going through hard stuff is we have this sort of like weird idea. Maybe it's been perpetuated by the church, I don't know, but that when you show up, you have to be a certain way on Sunday mornings. And that's just ridiculous, right? The church is here for everybody. No matter how you show up, you should be able to show up that way. So don't remove yourself from community with the idea that somehow it's going to be better for them, or you can't. It's just, don't do that now. If you're in lots of pain and it's just hard for you, I understand that piece of it. I do, but I would encourage you still to do your best. And this next point kind of plays into that. So number 4 would be what I call find a few. Find a few. It's very difficult in situations like this when you're feeling this way to just engage with tons of people. And I get that. I've been there. So what I would encourage you to do is find a few people. Tighten your circle to those who, number 1, have proven to you that they're not afraid of your pain. They're not afraid of your pain. They don't approach you like they're going to catch something. Right? They're not afraid of your pain, and they also won't use a bunch of cliches with you. They don't give you these sort of quick remedies, these quick cliches, just because they, again, are afraid of your pain or uncomfortable with where you're at, so they want to like rush you out of it. Have you ever been around people like that? Or it's just like they're sort of there out of obligation, but you get this sense they're like, oh my gosh, this is too uncomfortable for me, so let me just offer some really trivial stuff, so hopefully that'll magically fix them or whatever. But it doesn't work, and it frustrates you, and it's puts stress on the relationship. Find people who aren't afraid of your pain and who won't use cliches. Tighten your circle if you need to. And go to them and just be brutally honest. You know, in the Old Testament, the culture was that, and you see this actually in Job, that if somebody experienced a terrible tragedy, especially the death of a family member, a close family member, their friends would show up and they would sit in silence with them. And scholars say different amounts of time, but anywhere from 2 days to a week, they would sit in silence with that person, and they wouldn't say a word. It was their presence that was intended to be comforting, right? Because if you've been through that trauma, you know that in those times, advice, it's no good, right? If you need to expand that circle, if you don't have people like that, man, talk to any of the pastors here. We'd love to talk with you first and then maybe get you on to a Christian counselor if need be. But find somebody. A couple more here. Number 5, guard your heart. Guard your heart. When you're feeling this way and you're having a hard time, do these things that I've been sharing, but make sure in the midst of all this that you're guarding your heart against bitterness. And I think that's the one big caveat to some of this stuff is I want you to be honest. I want you to be forthcoming and truthful in all these ways and to engage in the process. But hopefully those people that I just talked about before, the few people and the Christian counselor if need be, or any of us pastors, that we can help you. I would say as you go to those people, say, I feel this way. What I don't want to do is to become resentful or bitter towards God. Could you help me with that? Could you help call that out of me if you see me start to head down that path? Because I don't want to do that. That's not going to end well. There's a line we cross, right? When we're going through struggles, and we don't want to cross over into bitterness, resentment. Right? And do not, in the same situation with this guarding your heart, don't fall into the entitlement trap. Right? And I mentioned this way back at the beginning of the message. If you've been alive for 5 seconds, you know that everybody goes through trauma and pain and suffering in various forms. And yes, some people seem to have a lot more than others. I get all that, but we all go through it. So don't fall into this trap that because you are who you are in some way, that you didn't deserve this or you didn't whatever, that it's not going to end well for you. Don't fall into that trap of entitlement. And I would ask the people again to help you guard against that. If you see me becoming entitled, like I was somehow, like God owed me better than this, don't go down that path either. The third thing with this guarding your heart is when you're in the midst of this season, don't make any massive decisions. Don't say, you know what, I feel like God has forsaken me, I'm going to quit my job. No. I'm going to switch churches. No. I cannot, I wish I could just like beat this into everybody's skulls. I can't, and Lori and Jordan are laughing right now probably because you see this so often. It's like you're in the worst mind frame you've ever been in, and now you decide to make these life-altering decisions? No, don't do that. Come out of the season. Get your head screwed back on straight. Get to a good place, and then take a look and analyze where you're at. And with much godly counsel, then make those decisions. Okay? All right, good. These last couple are brief, but I think they're important if you're taking notes or pictures. If Van wants to come on up, they can. And I have 4 more, but they're all short. Number 6, this is just something that's part of peace. Number 6 is alter your expectations. Alter your expectations. This is very simple. The reality of this is if you're in the middle of this season of pain and feeling like God's forsaken you, you're probably not going to snap out of it overnight. I know you probably want to. I've been there, believe me. Believe me. But that's probably not going to happen. Be patient with yourself in this season and find people that will be patient with you. Number 7 is make a list. This is a very practical thing you can do that from myself and many others I've known has been very important. Make a list when it comes, if you feel like you've been abandoned or forsaken by God, make a list of God's past faithfulness to you. I'm talking sit down with a piece of paper or on your phone, wherever you take notes, and start listing out all the times in your life that you've gone through something hard and God's blessed you in the middle of it. And not just those times, other blessings He's poured into your life. The friends you have, your husband or your wife, your children, though if they're a blessing. Because you're like, oh, never mind, scratch that. That's hard. But you know what I mean? Your job, your friend, name it, right? Just, I don't care. A great meal you had, right? Anything that's a blessing from God. Make a list of this, of His past faithfulness to you. So keep this make a list in mind for a second as we move on to 8. These two are linked together. Number 8 is another practical one. Serve someone who has it worse than you. There were a bunch of Christian psychologists who were asked if somebody was starting to go through a hard time and struggling with a bit of not clinical depression by any means, but just depressed in some ways, what would you tell them to do? And the far and away answer was, I'd tell them to find somebody who's going through something harder and serve that person. Right? Because what does this do? It gets you some much needed perspective. And it helps you, going back to number 5, guard your heart, it helps you guard against entitlement. Because what you'll find is lots of people who didn't deserve to have what happened to them happen to them. And lots of people who, in the midst, many times, of things way worse than you're going through, are able to maintain joy. And that's not to put pressure on you and make you feel bad. The idea is sometimes that can be contagious. Just like bad stuff can be contagious, so can joy. We know that neuroscience tells us that the emotions you experience when you're going through something, whatever it is, good or bad, but in this case we're talking about hard stuff. The emotions you experience when you're going through something hard have actually very little to do in the grand scheme of things with the actual situation itself. The emotions that you're experiencing when you go through something very difficult has to do with the narrative that you're telling yourself in your head. Right? We've all known people, I'm sure nobody in this room, but we've all known people who you could give them, they could win $1 million, right? And be like, well, I didn't get the 5 million jackpot though. Right? You're like, oh my gosh. Right, exactly. Yeah, or, I won $200 million, but they taxed it at 40%. Like, oh, geez. But a lot of times, serving someone who has it worse than you and making a list, these things, what they can begin to do, and man, we can talk about this for forever, but they begin to help change the narrative in your head. And man, there are a ton of awesome books written by Christian counselors and psychologists right now about shaping your brain a certain way and how that actually plays out, and we need to actually reshape our brains. We need to do things like this. The last one is simply this. In the middle of all that I've talked about today, right? Number 9, do the best you can. Okay? I don't want you to hear any of this as, oh man, he's telling me I got to do X, Y, and Z. This isn't a formula, right? There's, I think, some powerful stuff here. But when I say do the best you can, what I mean is start somewhere. Okay? Pick one thing I said today and begin to do that. Don't look at all 9 and go, I got to do all 9 tomorrow morning. If you can, great. If not, pick one, right? Pick one. Call up a friend and say, hey, I need to talk about how I really feel. Can we meet for coffee? Right? Something. Do one thing. Man, I know that so many of us have gone through these seasons. Some of us will. Some of us are. And man, the last thing that we want to do as a church is to have it be so that you don't feel this is a I hope today, for those of you that have gone through this or are going through it, that it's given you some sense of comfort. That it's given you a place where you feel like, man, I still feel like garbage, but I feel like now I have some traction at least. And I have a place to go. I can move out a little bit. And I want to get started. With that in mind, let me just pray to close as the band leads us. Jesus, I just pray for anybody right now in this room who's felt abandoned, who's felt that they've been forsaken. Holy Spirit, I pray right now that you would touch hearts and minds in this room right now. The people who came here feeling that way would leave feeling completely different. I pray for anybody in this room who has a skewed image of you, God, as Father, that's led them to believe things about you that have damaged their relationship with you in some way. I pray for healing in those areas. I pray for the Bible study, the book study on Wednesday nights that's going to be starting up. I pray that would be transformative for many people here who maybe they can say, yeah, God's good, but they don't actually truly believe it. I pray that they would leave that study knowing it, that you are good, and that it would transform their lives. God, we know that you do not forsake us or abandon us. But you've promised that. So we cling to you with all we've got in these seasons. We do our best. Give us the strength we need. Jesus, in your name.